Through the chair, I suppose the best, we do have a group within council who has relationships with developers, which is the Development Program Office. They've done work already as a part of this to look at some of the infrastructure needs. As that work goes on, I imagine that will be monitored. So I suppose overall they have a role in monitoring and coordinating that infrastructure to make sure that it's in place, and then I suppose seeing how it's going in reality. So that's a part of our operational division.
So Mr. Chair, sorry, and this goes to what some other councillors have asked. In instances clearly where we are presupposing, you know, busways or bridges or stuff, yeah, and things like consented and the buildings happening at pace, what then happens when they don't come out the other side? Because I think that's probably in the back of everyone's mind. What happens in terms of our ability then to respond? We don't have an ability, do we?
Dave, you've got.
Sorry, I'm slightly sorry, Thich, I'm slightly unclear about the question.
Can you clarify that question?
Well, if you read through the infrastructure sequencing considerations, and we're giving approval to developments of all manner, and they're actually premised on, you know, funds coming through, and I'm thinking particularly of transport infrastructure here as opposed to wastewater. The pattern of the last decade or so or longer in certain parts is where they just don't emerge. In fact, sometimes as projects are cut back, communities question they're asking, well, you know, what happens then when this stuff doesn't arise and we've allowed all this to happen? I guess it's a simplistic observation that, you know, we're left holding the baby, aren't we?
Yeah, through the chair, I'll try to answer that. I suppose this strategy is in effect the intentions of council at this moment in these greenfield areas. There's a number of parameters that could change this. I mean, the first is, you know, this is, as we've mentioned before, a lot of these things are unfunded. There will be processes that we need to go through, particularly the long-term plan, to establish what infrastructure that will in fact service and build in these areas. So obviously if the long-term plan makes decisions not to invest in some of this infrastructure whilst this sequencing is changed. The other side of it is that through structure planning and also working with developers, there is a process of, I suppose, these things being built. So there's factors around determining that, and a lot of that is about the land holdings in these areas and things like that, developer pick up itself. So this is why I suppose monitoring is important, so we understand how this strategy plays out, and it may need to be adjusted in time.
Thank you. Councillor Clough.
In the light of the answer David gave to the Mayor's question about is all this money effectively allocated or how much, I mean, do we need another resolution just to tighten this up a little bit to make sure that we have this work done sooner rather than later? Because it's not just transport, it is the other. And we're all zooming along on the premise that we're $4 to $5 billion short over the next decade, but maybe it's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we know, so do we need another resolution that's
Can I just ask you to expand on that, because there are quite a lot of balls in the air at the moment. We're consulting with the Auckland community on targeted rate application, funding source. We're discussing regional fuel tax, possible funding source. We're discussing ATAP with government, possible funding source. So there are a lot of balls in the air. None of them have landed at this stage.
I understand that, but I thought it would be quite useful to inform the councillors around this table the severity of our funding gap, and if it is much greater than what we've been bandying around, that will have an impact, I'd like to think, on the way some people may consider voting on whether it's 2.5 or 3.5 or 2, etc. And I just think it should be tightened up. But I don't know what Mr. Quinn, do you believe it should be tightened?
Could I invite Councillor Clough to draft something up? I'm very willing to accept it, to emphasise the significance of the funding gap. We already know that we have, from memory, it's a $4 billion in the first decade. These numbers have been refreshed just in the last few months, and we've gone from 17 billion out to 19.7 billion. On updated numbers. That's overall capital expenditure that could be hinged back to this council. I do not envisage it being hinged back to the ratepayers of Auckland. There's going to have to be, without doubt, alternative means of funding this city to accommodate those $20 billion number, approximately. So you asked for a response from
Well, I'm
Chief of
just
Strategy?
happy for Jim to actually just come up with something that helps him, that is going to,
Well, I think my response on that would be that the purpose of the future urban land supply is to signal the quantum, but to signal the 30 years. And as you know, our financial planning is 3 to 10 years. So I think we need to deal with these in steps. This is to identify and signal to the market where they can expect land to be released and what the constraints are, so that if we want to have a debate about moving those constraints because of growth or slowdown or whatever it is, then we know what it is, the constraints are that we've got to move and what it will cost. There's a whole separate piece of work which will come through committees like yours in terms of then how do we unleash that through any number of mechanisms which we've discussed. This wasn't.
yeah,
This
I understand, but
document's
given that most of the mechanisms we're looking at to actually try and solve our long-term issues are actually reasonably long-term,
Agreed.
and we've got huge pressing pressure now, basically, effectively over the next several years, and that's where the crunch is going to come, and you only need to look at our debt to revenue ratio and that, and we know we're really sitting there pretty damn tight for the next really 3 or 4 years. It's going to be extremely difficult.
Absolutely agree.
My second point was a question, really, is where is Watercare transport, everyone feeding into this, Panuku feeding into this? Because we've talked about it, overarching monitoring group and whatever, but we've also got the CCO family there already. Surely they are already having a big say in this, in the background.
Amanda, the role of our CCOs?
Through you, Mr Chair, Watercare, Auckland Transport, NZTA, other parts of council have been involved all the way through this process, from the first Future Urban Land Supply Strategy through to the review, the refresh. We have Watercare and Auckland Transport here with us today. So yeah, they are fully bought into this.
And I know Panuku's involved more in the brownfield development side of things, but I mean, I believe they're doing a little bit of a refresh on their categories as well, and who sits where. So they are obviously fairly involved, because this is actually just greenfield stuff.
And that possible expansion of the Panuku remit will be subject to our decision making. At this stage, they understand the parameters of their remit.
Okay, well,
That might change, but that's subject to our...
I'm happy to leave it then if it's...
Yep. I'll go to Mayor Goff.
Yeah, if I can just pick up, Mr Chairman, on Councillor Clowe's comments, because I think they're very relevant. We've got obvious sources, such as rating and borrowing, and we've equally got obvious limitations on the extent to which we can use those sources of revenue. Borrowing in terms of our debt to revenue ratio, which I think some of the central government officials are still having trouble getting their head around. Rating, if you consider a 1% rate increase raises you about $15 million, and we're talking about billions of dollars. You can see the limitations on ratings, and I think every councillor around the table understands that. But there are 2 live options that we are in the process of discussing with government at the moment. Road pricing is one of those, whereas the government has not agreed to a road tax, which would have seemed an obvious interim measure to many of us. They are not ruling out tolling, they are not ruling out congestion charging, and indeed a working party is set up to look at that. We're also looking at the $1 billion housing infrastructure fund. And it's clear that when we look at those numbers, 1 billion over 5 cities isn't very much, but there is still a problem with the Housing Infrastructure Fund, is that if it's a debt, it applies to our debt to revenue ratio. But that's an ongoing discussion, and I'll be meeting with the Prime Minister this Friday to continue that discussion. So I don't think we need the resolution now, but the purpose behind the resolution is I think obvious to everybody around this table. We have got some severe challenges, given the fact that we are growing by 45,000 people a year, and we can't handle that with our existing mechanisms for revenue raising. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillor Walker. Oh, Councillor Walker, by the way, you expressed a concern about the provision of parks and community infrastructure, and there wasn't enough of it. There's actually a workshop you may or may not be aware of that Councillor Hulse is convening quite shortly in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think, to address that very issue. These are the latest updated numbers, and of course, as the monitoring program puts in place, those numbers will be reviewed and I would suggest inflated. But your second question, Councillor Walker?
Also, I've got a question around the table around page 38, which is around the cost of the infrastructure, and other speakers have discussed that. Is it possible, at least in future agendas, to bolt out, to add on what the deficit is? What is the difference between what we can do now versus what we need? Because this is wishful thinking as it stands. And we need to know that. And my view, Mr Chair, is that at every opportunity, in every report, we should be indicating what the difference is between our wishful thinking and realism in terms of what our present funding tools give us.
Okay, look, it is a strategy rather than a future urban land supply, future thinking.
Well, strategy is useless unless you can actually complete
Amanda
it.
or David, can you just expand on what you've probably already told us about, how you've arrived at those budgets and where they sit in terms of LTPs in the future? I think that's the nub of the problem.
Well, in terms of arriving at these numbers, they've really been built up from the grassroots, from quite detail right up and then built up to these figures. So, for instance, the Transport for Future Urban Growth, now known as Supporting Growth, work was done over the last 18 months or so and has drilled into the sorts of network or elements that would be required to service these areas, and then calculated what those elements would cost. And that's been done across all of the infrastructures and then added up. So there's been quite a lot of technical work that's gone into these numbers. They've also been inflation adjusted and taking into account land prices. You want to...
And that's, I suppose, we built it up. It was always the intention, I suppose, of the strategy to feed into the long-term plans. I mean, that's the essence of the financial budgeting for council. So we always anticipated that work would flow into those processes. So in terms of, I suppose, shortfalls and things, I mean, that is the process that determines that in reality. So that's where we got to.
Yeah, through you, Mr Chair.
Lastly.
Just last question, and again it goes to this presentation, and that is, in an instance where you've got a box like this and we're dealing with significant numbers, can you provide the drill down references so that a member of the public, myself, anybody, can figure out just where things have come from?
Look, I'm going to call it
that could be done digitally.
Because that's the sort of question that should have been asked at the workshop, and we thrashed this out at the workshop. So I take your point. I don't think there's an answer for that question, and I'd like to move on. Councillor Lilly?
Yes, my question really relates to the public engagement process. There is an assumption all the way through this work of inevitability of the high growth scenario, as if there is absolutely no human choice or societal choice in the outcome. I am concerned, as I guess everyone will be, about the affordability of these growth scenarios. The central government in terms of these matters, urban development and so on, takes a hands-off approach by and large, but it is actively involved in immigration policies which are at record levels. My question is that while we have a list of Auckland, if you like, Auckland Council family-related infrastructure, the central government infrastructure, hospitals, schools, police, other services, power grids and so on, I don't see costed in, but altogether this is going to be enormous. And my question is, why can't we scope a lower growth scenario, which would be able to be achieved if the government were to change its, at least its immigration policy settings for Auckland, and became more proactive, a future government became more proactive in encouraging a more balanced growth and development over the country. I just would like to see some thought given to other possible scenarios.
Let's hear from the man.
These ones, that this high growth is not entirely inevitable at all.